Really pleased to be joined by Dr. Richard Lapchick from the University of Central Florida, human rights activist. You've been a pioneer for racial equality for basically your entire life, Dr. Lapchick, and also a proud UCF Knight, I should say, as well, since both of us certainly are. For those that are unfamiliar with your work, Dr. Lapchick, can you, fill them in on just what your life's work has been about and how you have been a pioneer for, social justice in this country for quite some time?
Well, it's going to sound strange to start out when I was 5 years old, but that's really when it started. And I looked outside my bedroom window in Yonkers, New York, where I was raised, and saw my father's image swinging from a tree with people under the tree picketing. And for several years after that, I'd pick up the extension phone in our house, and it was racial epithet after racial epithet being hurled at my dad. He didn't know I was listening, and I had no idea what it was about as a 5, 6, and 7-year-old, except a lot of people didn't like this man who was my best friend. And I would later find out that he was the coach of the New York Knicks and had signed the first African-American player in the history of the NBA. And there were a lot of people in 1950 who were not happy about that. He was, however, a great player. I wanted to be a great player. He was the first great big man. I was 6 feet tall in the 8th grade. I was one of the tallest players in New York City and was pretty heavily recruited. I was recruited by a school called Power Memorial. I didn't go there, but the coach invited me to go to his basketball camp the next summer, which I did, and there were 5 other white guys and a black guy at that camp. And one of the white guys was dropping the N-word on the black guy for the first 3 days till I finally challenged him. He knocked me out cold.
Wow.
And the black guy's name then was Lou Alcindor, who of course now is Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, and a lifelong friendship began that not only is so close that he asked me to speak at the Staples Center when his statue was unveiled. He invited me to the White House when Barack Obama gave him his Presidential Medal of Freedom. He came here to Orlando when I was scheduled to have surgery a number of years ago. But as a 15-year-old white kid, I suddenly had a young urban African-American lens to look at what racism was doing in his community. And I knew then that I was going to spend the rest of my life doing something in the area of civil rights. I didn't know what it meant at the time. And I certainly didn't think it would be involved in sports. But I went to graduate school. I was doing a doctorate on how South Africa used sport as part of its foreign policy and the international response to it. It later got published as a book. I started speaking about apartheid, formed the sports boycott of South Africa in 1975 during the height of apartheid. And in 1978, the first South African team was coming. It was a Davis Cup team that was going to play in Nashville, Tennessee. And I went down to Nashville for 4 days to try to build a protest. The African governments had asked me to announce they would boycott the LA Olympics if this team was allowed to come, the 84 games. So all 3 networks were there to cover that when I made that announcement. And Dick Schaap, who was then covering for NBC Nightly News, came up to me after I made that announcement before I addressed the student body and said, the financial backers of the Davis Cup had pulled out. It looked like the matches were going to be canceled. I announced that to the crowd. It was an anti-apartheid crowd. They went crazy. And when I flew home to Virginia, where I was teaching that night, I thought maybe for the first time in my life I was doing something worthwhile. The next night I was working late in my college office. The office was in the school's library. The library closed at 10:30. 10:45, there was a knock on the door, and I assumed, Ryan, that it was going to be the campus security who would normally check if they saw a light on, but instead it was 2 men wearing stocking masks who proceeded to cause liver damage, kidney damage, a hernia, concussion, and carved the N-word in my stomach with a pair of office scissors. I knew that night, laying in the hospital, that if people had gone to the length they did to try to stop my dad 28 years before and the length they did to try to stop me then that night, they must have thought we were having an impact on racism in America. So I decided that I was going to spend the rest of my life using the sports platform, because that's what we were using, to address various issues of social justice. And that's basically how it started and what I've been doing since that time.
What an unbelievable number of stories you told within that introduction. And you certainly did a much better job than I could have done in introducing you as well. Obviously, Dr. Lapchick, you and I are having a conversation based on the current climate we have, in our country right now, and certainly based off the events of what took place last week with the death of George Floyd. When you first saw the video, and again, you have been introduced to Black culture, far more than many people in this country have that are white. When you first saw that video, can you put into context what it meant for you and what you were thinking?
Well, it was horrific, obviously, the duration of it, anguished cries that he let out, and actually watching him die on videotape was painful for me, and it was, I think, for most people in America. It led, obviously, to the extensive demonstrations and protests that I think are unprecedented in their scope, both in the United States and overseas since that time. But for me, it brought back a familiar story. It was different, of course, was a different person, different, it was caught on tape. But, growing up, not only did what happened to me that I already explained happen, but, I was around when Emmett Till was killed, when the Birmingham church was bombed and 4 little girls were crushed to death in the process. Civil rights leaders were slain in significant numbers, and civil rights workers whose names we didn't know until that time. And, in the past 4 or 5 years, we've certainly seen with the capturing of smartphones on those smartphones incidents that maybe not as horrific, but we've seen people die at the hands of the police. And, these are things that all built demonstrations and protests. And the question I have is, those were never sustained. Is this going to be sustained? And I think I have a gut feeling that it is. I think there are some fundamental differences here.
Why do you feel that way? What makes this one different? I mean, we've heard about, black men and women being killed by police and police brutality for some time. What makes this George Floyd different?
I think the horror of the visual image is one. 2, the fact that the police didn't get charged for several days when it was obvious that it was a murder. You couldn't, looking at it, you couldn't argue that. I think the people out on the streets are the most diverse protesters I've ever seen. I've seen a lot of people commenting on that it's a very mixed crowd at all the demonstrations. And it's a very young crowd. And I think the Generation Z and the millennials are more committed, more compassionate, and more concerned about social justice issues than previous generations. And I think that's going to be a factor that will sustain it. And I think a third thing that will help sustain it is the fact that the world that I come from, the world of sports, we now have athletes who are speaking out on these issues. And they're heard. You and I could say something and it might make the news, but when a prominent athlete does say something, it does make the news. We only had to see the negative side of that last night with Drew Brees and the controversy around what he said about kneeling and having to apologize for it today. That's after a lifetime of doing great things in the city of New Orleans. But for the most part, athletes have been universally condemning the attack. 2 of the leagues have condemned the attacks. A lot of teams have. And those voices are amplified, and I think will build sustained programs in a lot of communities around the country to fight against racism in the future.
Dr. Lapchick, a lot of people have talked about, especially those in the Black community, there aren't more police brutalities happening against, Black people now than there were before. We're just getting to see them because of the advancements in technology and smartphones. You have people in the streets crying out for justice, saying that this is their chance to be heard. You mentioned why this has so much of an impact, but can you just shed some light on how long police brutality and racial inequality has existed in this country? I mean, 200 plus years, and how it can actually change, how today and this week and the last couple of weeks can actually change the course of history.
Well, I think that sustained voice is important if it can happen. I think the exposure, the extent of police brutality is pretty much in the public's eye now and in the public's discussion. I think the one thing that we're not talking about is the other effects of racism. We're talking about, pretty much just police brutality, but, a fact that I think says everything is that the Forbes list of the 100 wealthiest Americans have more aggregate wealth than all 24 million African Americans combined. How can we get our arms around that as a society that that's possible? We make up, we're 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population. They're mostly brown and Black. They're mostly in there for crimes that won't even be on the books in the next couple of years, minor drug offenses. I could go out with a litany of things that separate the races. And I think you hit on a key point that one of the differences I think that this generation is starting to do is actually listen to the Black community, not assume that they know what it's like to be Black, but actually listen to the pain and anguish of what it is like to be Black. And one of the reasons I agreed to tell the story that you asked me to about my personal background was in 1978, a lot of people came up to me and said, now you know what it's like to be Black. And my response to them was, I don't. I can walk away from this and resume my middle-class white life and never face discrimination again. If I was Black, that's just not possible. I'm going to face the possibility of something terrible happening every single day from me and all the members of my family.
Dr. Lapchick, we hit on this the other day. One of our reporters, Emerald Morrow, did a story on the two Americas that we live in, the Black America and the white America. And of course, referenced a lot of what Dr. King had said. And riots are the voices of the people that are unheard. And that's what we're seeing across the country right now. We live in two Americas, don't we? Still in 2020, we live in two separate Americas.
We always have. The only hope is that, this moment propels us to negate the history. I heard Kareem Abdul-Jabbar say the other day that he wavers between hope and history, the hope that things will change, and history tells him it probably won't. So we have to sustain that movement that's out there today in the streets and make this happen so that we don't have two Americas anymore.
How do you believe we truly changed this undercurrent of racial inequality that we've seen in this country? Like obviously we have protests, obviously people are speaking out, athletes are speaking out, but what do you think in all the years that you have lived in this world, do you think will actually force change?
I think if the voice of the people is sustained over, not months, but years, because this isn't going to change slowly. When Nelson Mandela became president in South Africa, everybody thought equality would come across the board, but he had to fight against 100 years of history of apartheid that had put all kinds of economic and social ties on the Black community there. Those ties can't be removed just in a year or two here, but they have to be systematically removed through legislation, through electing people who are going to be the voice of what we're talking about here today, not the voice of economic forces as they have been in the past.
I find it kind of ironic, Dr. Lapchick, that we might be in the most politically divisive time we've ever been in our country, yet these last 2 weeks, it seems we've been more unified as a society than maybe we've seen in quite some time. Do you agree with that sentiment?
I feel it. I feel it's different. It reminded me of a time in 1977, I was in Rwanda with my mentor, who had founded the anti-apartheid movement in this country back in the early 1950s. And I said to him, do you think we're going to see Guinea-Bissau, Mozambique, and Angola, the Portuguese colonies, Namibia, and then Rhodesia and South Africa ever become free in our lifetime? He said, Rich, I feel it. This was at a time that the Portuguese were running rampant over the Africans in those countries. The apartheid was at its height. It was being applied in Zimbabwe. Nelson Mandela was 12 years away from being released from prison. He said, I felt it. And 3 years later, the Portuguese colonies were free. And that man and I stood on the steps of the Union buildings in South Africa in 1994 at Nelson Mandela's inauguration in what was the greatest moment of my lifetime that was not related to seeing my kids being born or falling in love with my wife.
You have done such incredible work, Dr. Lapchick, and one of which, of course, is being one of the profound voices on diversity in sport. Obviously, with you starting the Institute for Diversity and Ethics in Sport and being the director of that, that certainly has helped. Give me an idea of where we stand from the sports landscape. We mentioned earlier a lot of the athletes that are able to use their platforms now that certainly didn't exist a decade or so ago to be able to speak out on social issues like this. How powerful is that to have those athletes that can use their voices to create change like we're seeing right now? Well,
specific to the world of sport, I'm urging those athletes to raise their voices about hiring practices in professional sport. The report cards that we do, the league offices do pretty well for both racial and gender hiring practices. The commissioners have control. But at the team level, for head coaches, general managers, team presidents, not so well. And I think that what's missing is, or what will change that is the voice of athletes. We have so many African-American athletes in the NFL and the NBA and Latino and African-American athletes in Major League Baseball. if they say we want to be represented more on the field, they're going to be heard because, and by the way, their teams are going to be better if the players think that the hiring practice is open, even if they hire another white guy, that they really think that people who look like them had a chance at it, because they're going to want to play for an owner that is open to who they are, not these two Americas, or if you're Latino, three Americas, but the one America.
The NFL has some work to do, right? I mean, we saw the statement, obviously, that Roger Goodell put out. I believe it was last week, but that league specifically, I know that your grades came out, and I think in October 2019, it was the lowest in the last 15 years. What does the NFL have to do to be able to be better and more diverse, being as it is the biggest league in our America?
Well, they tried to strengthen the Rooney Rule a couple of weeks ago. There was talk about a compensatory draft pick being added to that. I think that would have been a powerful lever for owners and coaches to, those draft picks are so highly valued, but they didn't go quite that far. I think that, we've had the Rooney Rule for a long time now. I went with Johnny Cochran and Cyrus Murray, two civil rights lawyers, to the NFL in 2001 to threaten a lawsuit if they didn't change their practices, and the Rooney Rule was the result of it. For a while, it did great things, but it's stagnant at this point. So I think that the commissioner has to be forceful. I think he's actually embarrassed by the situation as it exists now, because it's gone on for 2 straight years with the lowest percentage of head coaches in a decade. And, his players are 67% African American, and he knows, as does the league, that they are feeling their power, and their voices are going to be heard. And put in the context of what's going on in America today, I think it's adding an urgency to strengthening racial hiring practices in our leagues.
I mean, you mentioned last couple of years with the NFL. It's really been 4 years since Colin Kaepernick took a knee during the national anthem, which caused, a lot of national outrage. I think now his message is starting to be heard, at least hopefully across the country. From an NFL standpoint, Colin Kaepernick still doesn't have a job. That league has kind of turned a blind eye to what's been going on. Do you think that they've finally woken up and seen what this was all about, what his message was all about?
I think they've gotten his message, but I think they really have to embrace Kaepernick. And I see coaches around the league doing that. Whether or not he plays another game, I would love him to get another opportunity, because I think that would be a great signal for all the players. But I think they have to acknowledge that what he said was accurate, that his method, was really pretty tame compared to other possibilities out there. And I think, ironically, that kneeling is now going to be the symbol of the civil rights movement, not so much because of Colin Kaepernick, but what's happened this week, or the combination of those two.
Are you hopeful? Are you, do you have this sense that we are moving forward now from a racial standpoint and a justice standpoint in this country now, given what's happened?
I've been doing this for 6 decades in spite of not making that much progress across those periods of time. But I have to be in my inner self an optimist of some sort, because I wouldn't keep on doing it. But I think at this particular moment, it's different. I think at this particular moment, if the people continue to come together, that we're going to have a real opportunity to bring about meaningful change and make it really the one America we talked about.